Structural measures are any physical construction to reduce or avoid possible impacts of hazards or the application of engineering techniques or technology to achieve hazard resistance and resilience in structures or systems. As per UNISDR 2009, structural measures have been identified as what I just specified. And the examples are there can be dams, flood levees, ocean wave barriers, earthquake resistant construction, and evacuation shelters. UNISDR has defined non-structural measures as measures not involving physical construction which use knowledge, practice, or agreement to reduce disaster risk and impacts, in particular through policies, laws, public awareness raising, training, and education. And building codes, land use planning laws, enforcement, research and assessment, information resources, public awareness programs are all examples of non-structural measures. Land and land use is important to us, and therefore land use management, how can we use this tool so as to minimize or so as to prepare for disaster risks need to be understood. So land use management includes regulatory frameworks for buildings in terms of acts, regulations, codes, so as to minimize the likelihood of any eventuality during a disaster. And it includes both land use planning and development controls. So in land use planning, disaster risk assessment, hazard zoning for any city is essential, as well as the vulnerability assessment. The vision and the goals should reflect resilience and reduction of risk. So the strategies which comes therefore which should be put forth is protection of hazard prone and environmentally sensitive areas. The policy guidelines for resilient development in any city should ensure that development does not take place in hazard prone areas. Secondly, environmentally sensitive areas need to be protected. The land suitability analysis of any city would give us the hazard zones as well as the vulnerable areas. The development control regulations or DCRs that help us to regulate and control the development need to take into consideration the hazards of a city. And if you can see that depending upon the context, that is, if it is in a low-lying area, in a flood-prone area, then the development control regulations should respond to that context and should be according to that area. For example, in a steep slope, so the development control regulation for a steep slope which may be landslide prone, so one needs to understand that the development control regulation should be worked out accordingly. So one size fits all will not work for the city in terms of disaster risk reduction. So therefore, the design zoning ordinance, that is factoring of hazard information, would help us indicate the setbacks and buffers in hazard prone areas vis-a-vis any non-hazard prone areas. So the development control regulations need to be context specific, and thus specific provisions have to be taken for working out the setback, the buffers, the coverage, ground coverage or the plot coverage, the height in hazard prone areas. The permissible density and the layout of land should also need to be understood, and hazard resilient standards need to be worked out while designing utilities. Building codes specific to the hazard prone areas need to be worked out for in cases of design, construction, alteration and maintenance of structures. The structural measures specifically for floods would pertain to embankments, flood or cyclone shelters, dams, as I was referring to earlier. And basically structural measures aim at protecting an area up to a certain level of flooding. And it can be divided into 5 categories, that is storage reservoir or basins to restrict overflow, retarding basins to lower the flow of flooding, levees and flood walls to confine flood waters, improvement of channel capacity, and then flood embankment, channel improvement, river training, dams and reservoirs for impounding excess runoff, detention basins, retention. So the structural measures or specifically if we see the non-structural measures for floods, it would relate to floodplain zoning and management, policies for planning of infrastructure and development in the floodplains, flood proofing measures, flood forecasting and warning, flood insurance, then shelter management, watershed management and afforestation, institutional arrangements. While we mitigate the effects of these various disasters and prepare the city, a variety of strategies, including compliance with the building planning regulations, land use planning, and planning of critical infrastructure, specifically physical infrastructure, economic development plans, public health plans, transportation plans, land use planning needs to be worked out. In case of physical infrastructure, which includes stormwater drainage, wastewater, solid waste, and water supply, the strategies pertain to avoidance of locating facilities in high risk areas, and one has to check whether resistance and redundancy has been incorporated in the plans. Have the at-risk assets climate proof? What are the impacts on local supply, demand and infrastructure networks? The economic development plans would relate to whether the local economic capacity and exposure issues have been identified, whether the socially and economic vulnerability have been identified, whether opportunities for the socially and economic vulnerable groups have been identified, are green development opportunities being developed? And regarding the land use planning, the questions which need to be answered are: have local hazard areas, for example flooding areas, been identified? Have low development and no development plans designated? Is there a framework for frequent evaluation of local development and growth patterns? The transportation plans also need to pertain to connectivity by roads, then pedestrian movements, transit and bicycle infrastructure. And the questions which need to be answered and looked at is that: have weak transportation links been identified? Are the emergency transportation networks coordinated? Have at-risk assets been identified? And finally, the public health plans need to answer the following questions, that is, are health impacts and socioeconomic risks included? What are the health risks in terms of heat waves, waterborne diseases, etc.? Are there local strategies to minimize adverse effects? So all these plans and all these questions need to be answered through various strategies encompassing all these aspects or themes in order to achieve resilient development and reduce disaster risks.